Okay, the title looks very informal. It is going to be very informal. So I'm going to try and speak, design the talk to try and speak a bit more to the non-academics policymakers in the room for two reasons. One is that I'd like to have follow-up conversations with all of you about potential projects that come out of the ideas that I'll discuss. But also because I've set this crazy goal for myself, which is I want to be comprehensible to everything I say, to be comprehensible to every single person in this room. Okay. Kind of crazy, but we'll try. And I designed the slides last night based on things I heard yesterday. So I paid attention to the questions that was coming, especially from the policymakers in the audience, and thought that it would be valuable for me to present the results of a few research projects, but I'll do it in a way that's with not with equations, but more with graphs and pictures. So one question that kept coming up yesterday is, we saw a number of papers that analyze data that suggests that there is going to be large welfare gains from moving people from rural to urban areas or from poor labor markets to rich labor markets. Okay? But one question that came up from policymakers multiple times was, but where are these jobs going to come from? Okay, is there any evidence that there are actually jobs there? Okay? So I'm going to show you some results that suggest that if you do move people, jobs seem to appear. Okay? And they do well. But I'm going to be able to do this in the context of seasonal rather than permanent migration. I think there are other results by other researchers that also suggest that the returns to permanent migration for the migrants are also very large. But I'm going to be able to show you very clean evidence that the returns to seasonal migration, moving poor people from rural areas to urban areas within the same country, where you don't have to worry about bigger policy issues like border restrictions, the returns there are very large as well. And the second reason that I want to talk about this is that yesterday when we talked about moving people, I think everybody in the room, in the audience, had this idea implicitly that we're talking about permanent moves, right? But it turns out that a lot of the moves in developing countries are actually seasonal, circular, temporary in nature. There's not many people that collect data on seasonality or seasonal migration, but the few data points we have from Vietnam, China suggests that there's maybe 50 times as many seasonal migrants as there are permanent migrants. So this might be a really important component of moves to study. Okay? And it also points out that that there is big gaps in seasonality or fluctuations across seasons between rural areas and urban areas, and that's another source of inefficiency that we may want to arbitrage. That maybe the spatial allocation of people to places is efficient overall, but during certain months of the year there is big spatial misallocation. Okay. All right, and then if we're going to start moving people, so here's the second set of results that I want to cover. We're going to have to tackle some really important challenges, which is access to public services for the urban poor. Right? Poverty, we know, is increasingly urbanizing. More and more poor people in the world every year live in urban areas now. And yesterday, Abhijit presented some really interesting results that suggest that the urban service delivery challenge is quite problematic. Even if you provide information to policymakers, they don't do anything about it. People end up living in places that are full of garbage and full of dirty toilets. Okay? So I'm going to tell you about what the big challenges are, my interpretation of what he was saying yesterday based on some results I have, as well as some solutions that might actually work. Okay? That this is something that we ought to be thinking about, and there are some promising approaches here. Okay? So that's my roadmap for what we're going to do today. So migration and then sanitation. And in fact, in order to connect the two, I did run one new regression to talk about the sanitation behavior of migrants. So I'm really excited by these results that came like 5 hours ago. We're going to talk through that. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about seasonality. And this is data from Bangladesh. This is the household income expenditure survey that covers, it's a representative sample of Bangladesh. But I can't say too much about urban areas here because most of the survey was done in rural areas. But this is the area called Rangpur in northwest Bangladesh that we will do a project whose results I'll describe. Right? So Rangpur is much poorer than the rest of the country, right? But the other thing that's happening in Rangpur is that there is a lot more seasonality. Okay? So what do we have here? This is seasonality in the price of rice. So there are two things I'm going to show you. One is that there is a period the pre-harvest season when the price of rice spikes up, right? And it's also the season that people's incomes drop because. So let me kind of describe the situation to you. So most agrarian areas, this is actually not just about northern Bangladesh. Most agrarian areas in the world, other places I work, like in Malawi, Mozambique, and Indonesia, farmers get all of their income during the harvest. Okay, in Bangladesh happens to be January. Okay, and you plant your rice in around August. So between September and November, you're basically just waiting for the plant to grow, right? And there's not that much work. So there is some work, like some weeding, etc. But for the landless poor who are dependent on supplying agricultural labor, so wages fall, employment conditions are pretty bad. Okay, so your income's dropping, and at the same time, the price of rice goes up. Okay, so this combination of low wages, high prices means that your consumption really drops. Okay? So people are spending less money overall during this period in Rangpur, but they're actually spending more money on food. Okay. And the combination leads to much lower caloric intake. Okay, there's a huge fall in caloric intake. In fact, in Bangladesh, it takes the form of a seasonal famine. In Malawi, there's this concept of a hungry season, that you're expected to go hungry during part of the year. You eat twice a day. We were just in Garrett, Melanie and I are doing a project in eastern Indonesia. I was just there 2 months ago. Again, people report that the way they cope is you eat 2 times a day or you don't eat any kind of protein. Right? You just get cheap sources of food. So seasonality, I think, is very important, and this is another aspect of rural areas, another source of inefficiency, another source of welfare losses that we might want to address. Okay, so how did we go about understanding these issues? So this is a project I'm describing. This is already published. It's with Garrett, who's here, and Chowdhury, who's at the University of Sydney. Okay. So we're working in 100 villages, and we started with 1,900 households, and I'll tell you, by the end of the project, we're actually this year now working with about 30,000 households. So we randomly assign some incentives for people to migrate to nearby cities. Okay? And so in some villages, this is done as a randomized control trial. So if we have a control group, we're not doing anything. In some villages, we go in and say to some households that here's the equivalent of about $8.50, which is roughly the cost of a round trip bus ticket plus a couple of days of food. Okay? And we say, okay, here, you can have this money as long as somebody in the household decides to migrate during this lean season. Okay? So we just want you to try it out. If you go for 3 days, come back, mini vacation, it's fine, but we need somebody to try it out and you can have this money. And I'm just subsidizing the cost of migration. If you go, come back, you're no worse off. Okay? So, and then we do it in the form of a loan in another set of villages. Now, in these villages, when we go into a household and offer migration money, of course, we have to provide some information about why we're doing it. So we collected some data at the destinations in the cities, that these are the sectors you can find work in. These are the average wages, right? So we provide that information. And I wanted to separate out the effect of the information from the cash, and that's why we have another arm where we just provide the information without the money. So exact same script, no money. Okay? So this you should be thinking of cash plus information versus information. Okay? And then we did several rounds of follow-up. So started in 2008, and we now have actually 5 years of data on these guys. Okay? All right, here, and I'm going to show you the main results. Okay, so the paper is long. So there's the program evaluation results, and then we have a lot of theorizing about why people weren't migrating. Right? But let me just first show you what happens when you induce people to migrate. Okay? So that was kind of our set of motivating facts. Okay. So the first thing is. So let's start with the control group. In the control group, about a third of households, 35.9% of people migrate. Okay, that's part of their coping strategy. If you provide the information without the money, 35.9% of people migrate. It has a 0.0% effect on their decisions. Okay? So it's not an information failure. It's not like you didn't know the city exists. And think about it, if a third of households are migrating in your village, you know some neighbor who's migrated, so you know that this is a possibility. So us providing information doesn't have any effect. But if you provide the money, either in the form of a loan or grant, the migration rate jumps to about 58%. Okay? So you can induce about a quarter of households to try this out. That's the first result. People go if you give them money, and it's just a little bit of money. Okay? The second result is now we can, this is going to be the the worst looking slide. It's the only one with numbers. Okay? But I'll talk through it. Okay. So the second result is, so now that a person is gone, so the way it works is usually the adult male, the male household head, is the one migrating. It's not a full family migration. He's just going for a couple of months and then coming back. Okay? And then so we can collect very rich data on his family as well as non-migrant families in the treatment group and the control group. Right? So we have a very good way to compare what happens when some people migrate. Okay? So the result you get is, so across all these numbers, different types of specifications, what you end up getting is if you are induced to migrate by this $8.50 transfer, then your family ends up consuming about 600 calories per person per day more. Okay? So it's about 30% increase in consumption across both food and non-food consumption. Okay? And that's the difference in that famine season I described. That's the difference between 2 meals a day and 3 meals a day. Okay? So people are, on average, in the sample, and the IV results suggest that people are going from about 1,700 to 2,300 calories. But it turns out most of our effect is actually coming from the left end of the distribution. Okay? And then beyond eating more, there's also some movements into more protein consumption. And also, something I'm not showing is people are getting their protein from tastier sources. So things like meat and fish as opposed to dal. Okay, so that was the second result. People go, and if they go, their families are a lot better off, and all established with a randomized control trial. And I should tell you a little bit about what is happening here. So when the guys go to the destination, we observe them, and we also collect data on them at the destination, and they earn about $110 over these 2 months. Right? So 2/3 of those caloric intake effects that I showed you comes from the fact that this guy's taking care of himself in the city. There's one less mouth to feed at the origin. Right? And about 1/3 of it is coming from the fact that he actually has more money that he's saving. So out of the $110, he seems to be able to save about $55. And we observe about 2 trips per household. So what happens is he goes for a month, he comes back with some money, right? Rests up, sees his family, and then goes back again a second time. And the second trip, we're not subsidizing. Okay? Okay, and then finally, this is the result that really was most stark and helped us understand what was going on. Is that we continued collecting data in these villages over multiple years, and we left a sample such that we could just track long-term effects. Right? So we didn't mess with the with those villages again. So we never ran the program again. But people in those treatment villages continue to migrate at a higher rate than in the control village, even though in the second year we weren't doing anything. Okay? So not all 58% of people chose to migrate. It came down to about 48%. So about half the people who we induced chose to go back again on their own volition. Okay? So that's all the results I'll tell you. You can get people to go. When they go, they do well, their families do well in terms of consumption, and then they choose to go back again. Okay? So then we tried to understand exactly why would we see these results? So if it's so good in so many ways, why the heck did we have to run this program? Right? Why were people already not migrating? Right? And so that's where the meat of the economics paper is. So we have a model that helps us understand what we saw. And the model is basically this, so imagine I give you a lottery ticket that costs $10, and I tell you that there's an 80% chance it'll pay off, which is what our data show. Like for 80% of migrants, this is a sensible thing to do. Okay? And when it pays off, you'll get like a 300 or 400% return. Okay, would you be interested in buying the lottery ticket? Yeah, of course, it's a great deal. Right? So the puzzle is why are these people not buying that lottery ticket? Okay? But now imagine I make you that offer of that lottery ticket while your family is under the threat of famine and you're very close to subsistence, just surviving. And if you're $10 poorer, somebody might fall below subsistence. Then it's much more difficult for you to make that decision. If you cannot manage the downside risk of failure, even if the probability of failure is small, like 20%, right, it might dominate your decision making. Right? So for the economists in the audience, it might just be that utility functions are very steep, close to subsistence, right? And there might be, say, negative infinite utility associated with a loss or going below subsistence. Right? So that can help explain the set of facts that I showed you based on the randomized control trial. Right? And then what we do is we take this model, then we go back to the data and test the model. So things like if that story is right that I just painted, then we should see that people who are very close to subsistence should not be migrating, even though we know generally that poor people migrate, right? But then those are the people who should be most responsive to the program. And that's exactly what you end up seeing in the data, right? We also ran a new round of experiments, which was that if you believe this model, then we ought to be thinking about insurance for migration as opposed to grants, right? So we provided insurance, and people responded even more strongly when we got the insurance right that was addressing a risk. Okay. And then finally, once you do all this, the remaining puzzle is that, look, all of the data seems to fit the model very well, but a lot of people, you correctly pointed out, but we can't believe that people are that risk averse, right, quantitatively, that they would not be taking advantage of this opportunity, right? And in particular, some referees pointed this out, so we had to do something about that. And it turns out the referees were right? So then we go about calibrating this model where we allow people to save up to migrate, right? Because the one way to think about the point is, right, so if it's so good, if migration is such a profitable activity, right? And even if you're close to subsistence, what you should do is whenever you have a little bit of extra money, you should save it up, right? Buy a bus ticket, and then go and convert that into $40 from the 10, right? And that's what's really hard to explain. So if you allow people to save, then I have to put a lot of pressure on the risk aversion parameter to explain all of these results, okay? So risk aversion of sigma of about 8 or 9 is what our data show. And in the equity premium puzzle literature, that's totally okay, par for the course. But then Garrett pointed out, look, Garrett's like, if really people are that risk averse, they shouldn't be getting up from bed. And which is true. And so then what we end up by saying is, look, this model is not going to be able to explain all of these results unless you add some other friction. So, for example, if people are savings constrained, there is a lot of evidence in the literature that it's really difficult for you to save up. Whenever you have money in your pocket, maybe your cousins take it from you, right? They tax you. In that case, you can begin. If you add that kind of a constraint, you can begin to explain these results, right? Okay, so what's happening next? And this is also where I'd really like to. This didn't come out very well. Make a pitch to the policymakers. So there's this organization called Evidence Action, which takes research results that show promise, that pass rigorous tests like randomized controlled trial-based tests, and they think about potential for scale-up across countries. Okay? So they have taken this up. So they've done some scale-up with this deworming medicine work that Michael Kramer has done in the past, and Ted Miguel, and with some water chlorination stuff. So they've taken this up, and they're now collecting data, scaling this up. So I'm just helping them think through a couple of things. So one is, so I showed you a bunch of results. So here's where policymakers ought to be really careful about interpreting the results that I showed you. Okay, so I showed you a bunch of results that involves incentivizing up to 2,000 people to migrate. Okay, now if I were to, and the results were very positive, right? But instead of 2,000, if I were to incentivize 20,000 or 200,000 people to migrate, it might be that the conditions change at the destination. There might not be enough jobs to go around, right? So that's what we call general equilibrium effects, which is that wages might change at the destination. But it might also be counterbalanced by the fact that there would be positive general equilibrium effects at the origin, right? If some people leave, then those scarce jobs during the pre-harvest season, the remainder of the people who stay behind, they might be better off. So we want to think about not just the direct effects on the beneficiaries, but these indirect effects on the people they're competing with in the village and in the city, right? So I'm trying to help them do that, and the way we are doing it is now, they've put up the money to explore this. We're working with 30,000 people, and I'm randomly varying the proportions of people we're trying to induce to go out. And with random variation of the proportions, you can start studying general equilibrium effects. Okay? There might be unintended consequences. You might worry that the migrant brings back some disease or something from the destination, right? So we're trying to track things like that. And they're just really, this organization is just really interested in whether or not this is a policy that they can actually implement and think about the practical considerations. Like, do we buy them bus tickets? How do we ensure that they migrate, etc. Okay? And with Garrett and Melanie, who's still sleeping, we're doing some replication exercise in Indonesia. We're trying it out in Ghana. We tried it out in Malawi. And let me tell you about the failure, because we learn a lot from the failure as well. So I sent a student last summer to go to Malawi, another country where I work, to see if this type of work would, did they have this hungry season? Would you would this be a relevant policy to try it out here. But it turns out in Malawi, unlike Bangladesh, there are no cities with very vibrant labor markets, right? And so you need two conditions. You need the seasonality in the origin to want to do something about it, but at the destination you actually need jobs, right? So Malawi doesn't seem like a good place to try this out. Okay, so I'll use my last 10 minutes to talk about now migrants. So what I've hopefully convinced you is that it's promising to try out whether or not we should be encouraging people to be moving from rural to urban areas, at least for a particular season, okay, when things are really bad at the destination. But now let's talk about, okay, if these migrants go and populate slums, okay, that might make conditions in the city much worse, and we have to think about how to provide those public services. So let me tell you a few results on successes and failures there. Okay. Okay, so slums look bad. This is a picture I took in, I took it in Nairobi, in the Mukuru slum in Nairobi, where I'm doing tomorrow. Let me skip, okay. All right, so let me tell you just one quick result from our rural area, okay? So we do this program in order to try to improve sanitation behavior at the origin, in the villages, right? And then I also look at what happens to the migrants from these villages once you do sanitation marketing in the village. What happens to the sanitation behavior in the city? Do they continue to practice open defecation? Okay? So open defecation is a big policy problem. So about 55% of Indians still continue to practice OD. I'm going to try and limit my use of the word defecation from now on. And so you do this marketing. So there's actually an NGO in Bangladesh called VERG that invented this model called the community-led total sanitation. So you get the whole village together. You do a community map where people note down exactly where the roads are, where they live. And then you ask, okay, people mark down, whoever has toilets in their house, right? So they do that. And then you notice that most people don't have toilets. And that's kind of a polite way for you to start talking about toilets and defecation. Oops. And then once you note that many people don't have toilets, you ask them to mark exactly where in the village they go. So they mark it in some different color, say yellow-colored chalk powder, right? And then soon you realize that the entire village looks yellow. Okay? And that gives you an opportunity to start talking about, look, there's a lot of this stuff, how much of it's generated per month or per year, and where does it all go? And then you show them how it can get back into their food system, through flies, through fingers, or whatnot. Okay? And so we did this kind of an experiment where we actually did this as a randomized control trial. We provided this kind of a latrine promotion program, right? But then in other arms, we tried out different things. So latrine promotion program plus subsidies targeted to the poor, right? Or instead of working with the demand side, trying to generate demand, right? Another set of people in the policy world, in the sanitation policy world, they think that it really is about creating markets. Obviously, people want to use toilets. They just don't have toilet parts available. If you create the supply chain, they'll come and change their behavior. It's not really a demand-side problem. So we tried that out as well, and then we tried out combination of demand and supply. Okay? And then the final thing I did, which is what I'm going to focus my results on, is that within the subsidy areas, okay, so in these villages, people are getting subsidies, but I randomly varied what proportion of the poor are offered subsidies. So 25%, 50%, 75%, okay? Because that helps us understand whether or not these sanitation decisions are interlinked across communities. So what happens if Ed gets a subsidy along with 70 or 50% of his friends relative to me getting a subsidy? So we're facing the same price, but only a quarter of my friends get it as well, okay? And let me show you those results, right? So I'm just going to focus on hygienic latrines, which is the behavior we're trying to promote, okay? So let's this is Ed versus me, okay? So both of us got subsidies. This is the level for me, which is me and 25% of my friends got it, okay? And this is the investment for Ed, right? So what happens is if Ed, so he and I are facing the same subsidized price, but if more of his friends got subsidies at the same time, he's actually more likely to convert that voucher for a discounted toilet into an actual investment than I am, okay? And that's even true for Garage and Gilles, where say Gilles does not get a subsidy, he gets unlucky, right? He doesn't pull a green card, he pulls a red card, right? But Garrett also gets unlucky in his village, right? He doesn't get a subsidy, but most of Garrett's friends do. Then what happens is Garrett becomes more likely to invest in a toilet at full price, just because his friends are getting subsidies at the same time. Okay, so this strongly suggests that sanitation decisions appear to be interlinked in a community, right? And this might be because of social norms, or it might be because, when most of the people around you are defecating in the open, then it doesn't even make sense for you to invest in a toilet because your kids are going to get sick anyway, right? And then this is true, the toilet investment results I showed you, this is also true in terms of reductions in OD. Right? If people around you are building toilets, your OD goes down. Okay? And finally, this is the regression I ran just for this talk. So it turns out, so in these villages, this is a very large-scale randomized control trial. I'm doing it on 76,000 people, covering 4 sub-districts in Bangladesh, like 100% of the sub-districts. And so there's lots of migrants from this sample, people who are just migrating naturally. And so I can then look at what happens to the migrants who are moving from these 380 communities. What do they do in terms of sanitation when they move to the city? Okay? Turns out that if you are given sanitation marketing in the village, you carry those behaviors to the city with you. Okay? So this is pretty exciting. I'm going to now spend some time thinking about exactly what to do with this. Okay? People are taking their habits. If you teach them something in the village, they seem to be taking those habits to the city with them. Okay? All right, and then now a little bit, like just 2 minutes on the things that Abhijit was talking about yesterday. So he mentioned that, look, we're giving people, we're giving politicians information on how they can improve the sanitation situation and simple things they could do, and they're not doing anything about it, right? So I actually had a different interpretation to this. I think the problem is really complicated, right? And I know it's complicated because along with colleagues at JPEL, for the last 3 years, we've been trying to build toilets in 2 cities in India, public toilets in Bhubaneswar and Cuttack, which are 2 cities in Orissa. And we are experimenting with like how to design the toilet. Should it just be a toilet, or should there be bathing facilities, etc.? Do people care about a broader set of amenities or just toilets, right? And we're also experimenting with how we manage those toilets, right? Should it be because the main problem with these toilets is after the hardware gets built, as Abhijit showed in his pictures, the toilets become decrepit and dirty very quickly. Nobody wants to use them because nobody wants to manage. And the reason is it's a shared facility. Nobody has the right incentive to clean unless you're making money off of it, and you're typically not. Okay? So the experiments we're doing is we're bringing in private sector managers for half the toilets versus offering it to the community, thinking that maybe the community guys will be more accountable to their neighbors and manage the toilet better. Okay? And we actually, on the design phase, like I have these subcontractors who are architects and design people, and they do a nice job thinking through the anthropology. They do a lot of anthropological research on exactly what people want. They design things nicely. But when we try to start constructing these things, right, now you need land permission. So the city commissioner in Bhubaneswar is totally on our side, but he doesn't have the authority to give us land permission to expand facilities or take down old, decrepit facilities and replace them. And it's just a bureaucratic maze. So for 3 years, we've been working on this, and we're just starting to build some toilets now after 3 years, right? This was supposed to be my tenure clock was up. It was a total waste as far as career concerns go. And then finally, let me also show you that in Nairobi, this is the last 2 minutes, and I'll be done. We're trying to see how do we get people, urban migrants, to be using toilets that already exist. Okay? So I'm working with so the idea here is that everything I've talked about so far, all the results I've showed you, suggests that people think about costs and benefits carefully in making these decisions on what to use, whether to migrate, and so forth. But some of these decisions might also be driven by something more basic, just habits. Okay? And so this is what the slum in Nairobi looks like. But there's a company, a very impressive company called Sanergy, started by a couple of Yale grads, I'm proud to say, who went on to get an MBA at Sloan, and then they started this company in Nairobi. They just gave up lucrative consulting careers and are working on solving the sanitation problem in slums in Nairobi. So they put up these fantastic toilets in the slum. Okay? So these are kind of like porta potties that you see in the U.S., but really high-tech ones. And they have a very nice logistics system where every day they come and collect buckets that they've thought through very carefully. It fits into a cartridge in a truck, and they empty it all out, and they're trying to then dry it and turn it into fertilizer. Okay? And the amazing thing here's why I think just marketing matters so much. One amazing thing about their model is, this logistics of getting rid of waste is really important, but they spend like half of the total price of the toilet on just painting it blue. Okay? Apparently, just having a nice blue, bright thing there, they think is more important for marketing than anything else. So what we're trying to do is, right now, we're trying to get more people to use these toilets. Right? So I'm working with them on that, and we're trying to do these habit experiments where I was really, I don't have time to talk about this, but I was really inspired by how Pepsodent got the U.S. population to start brushing their teeth. If you have questions about that, maybe there'll be a Q&A session that I can tell you about. But we're basically saying that, look, we can, if we can create queues, create rewards, maybe we'll get people to use toilets. And we're doing these economics experiment where I'm basically trying to bribe people to use the toilet at specific times of the day, every day for a couple of months, and then observing, okay, what happens after the 2-month period ends. Okay. All right, so sorry, I had to rush through all of that. And it was really important for us to do marketing carefully. So there's a firm in New York that's helping us do all of that in a very nice way. Okay, so let me just conclude now. So solving the city amenity issue, I think, is very complicated and difficult, right? Especially when you're talking about slums that require shared facilities, and the incentives are all screwed up. Nobody wants to take care of it, right? Changing the behaviors of slum dwellers is also very difficult, right? So it's not just about providing services, but I think the demand side is important as well. Okay, so this requires innovations both from policymakers and researchers, and I hope conferences like this will create more interaction and more joint projects that help us do more with this. Okay? But, I hope the first set of results I talked about on migration has convinced you that it's actually worth trying to tackle these very complicated problems. Right? The returns to having people move from rural areas to cities, at least for particular seasons where the situation is particularly bad in rural areas, right? The welfare gains associated with that is very, very large. And so it's important for us to try and think about whether we can make those cities and the slums habitable. Okay? And I'll end there.